So what is Gnosticism anyway? It is a religion of understanding. Gnostic means one who understands. Gnosis is a special kind of understanding about the nature of the world that comes to one from outside of oneself, from outside of the world. It is true knowledge of the world. And the Gnostics claimed to possess this. And it's a very peculiar kind of knowledge because it divides one from the world. Essentially, the message of Gnosticism is that man is a stranger in this universe, that we have no business here, that in fact this universe is the creation of an inferior being, a mad god, if you will, and that we are somehow trapped in a situation not of our own making. And it is for the Gnostic to, number one, understand this, and then number two, to do something about it. And first of all, the gaining of this understanding was through ecstasis, perhaps drugs, although I am myself so associated with drugs that I don't want you to get the impression that I am making a case that there is any evidence that Gnosticism was a hallucinogenic-based movement. It may have been, but there is no evidence for it. There is greater evidence that there may have been sexual techniques and practices used to induce ecstasy. But again, even this is very thin because the most flamboyant charges of sexual practices are those laid against the Gnostics by their enemies. And in fact, until 1948, everything that we knew about Gnosticism, we knew from studying attacks upon it. The fathers of the early church, Origen, Justinian, Tertullian, Irenaeus, Clementine, Justin, the patristic fathers, were at great pains to refute Gnosticism, and in fact their intense preoccupation with the refutation of Gnostic ideas is a major clue to how important these ideas were in the situation where embryonic Christianity was taking form. It's in the writings of Eusebius and Hippolytus that the most outlandish descriptions of Gnostic practices are met with. In those same works, we meet recitations of Gnostic prayers that in fact do coincide with later texts recovered from different sources. So the question of how apt a description of Gnostic practice we get from the patristic heresiologists has to remain a very open one. Now, this is a situation which you would think would lie fallow. This is an ideological religious movement that by the 6th century was largely crushed out within the confines of the empire. However, in 1948, at a place called Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, near a Coptic monastery called Chenabaskian, people were feeding their goats and digging in the side of the hill, and they came upon large clay jars filled with manuscript. And they took this stuff back to their house. They were goat herders. They needed to make tea, so they burned a number of the manuscripts immediately to make tea and discuss what should be done with the rest of them. Well, it's a very long story, but when it filtered to the surface, there were 52 texts that had gone into the ground AD 350, and so had never been touched by the patristic reformation of the church, the councils of Nicaea, Antioch, and Trent. This stuff existed completely sealed away from the evolution of Christian hermeneutics from the patristic period forward. And now all of this material has been translated, and it composes a corpus which is called by scholars the Nag Hammadi Library. And these 42 texts are like a window back into the world of Hellenistic gnosis, and it raises very serious problems for Christian theology generally, for a number of reasons. We knew from Qumran that there was a document called Q that appeared to be the source of both Luke and Matthew, and older than both. Now at Nag Hammadi, the Gospel of Thomas has emerged. It also is obviously very closely related to this document Q, which precedes the other two Gospels. And the picture which emerges of Christ is very much at variance with the notion that has come down through time. To give you a bit of background on this, most scholars believe that Christ was born in 6 AD and died in 27 BC. There's new arguments that he may have been crucified as late as 33. However, there is no argument that there are no gospel sources older than AD 70. So basically there's a 35-year lacuna where we don't know what Christianity was or even if it existed. And into this lacuna come the documents like the Gospel of Thomas and the Q document from Qumran, which cast great light, great doubt on the traditional picture that's emerged of Christology. So that's only one aspect of the challenge of the Gnostics. The other is to come to terms with their worldview and to try to make sense of it. And this is really what the body of my talk tonight is about, because we are, if we accept Spengler's notion that the Hellenistic era is somehow an adumbration or a temporal resonance of our own, then we as moderns standing as we do on the brink of star flight, are in a position to essentially realize the Gnostic cosmology, because what the Gnostic cosmology consisted of was the notion that having fallen so deeply into physis, having fallen so deeply into matter, man had become subject to fate in the form of stellar demons. And the Gnostic interpretation of astrology was entirely negative. For the Gnostic, the machinery of stellar fate was horrifying, deterministic. It reinforced the Gnostic notion that the universe is an iron prison into which man has fallen and must fight his way out. And so they believed that at death, the spark of the higher and invisible God, whose presence was nowhere apparent in this universe except in the soul of man, that spark would make its journey through the spheres back outside the machinery of cosmic fate to be reunited with what was called the higher and hidden All-Father. And there was great stress laid on the alienness of the hidden God and of the alienness of man in relationship to the world. And if any of you were present for my lecture called Alien Love, where I discussed the notion of alienness generally and its relationship to the extraterrestrial, in Gnosticism, specifically in the schools of Gnosticism associated with Marcion, you get this first enunciation of the notion of the strange or alien God. And it's a very peculiar idea, which Gnosticism carried forward within itself until the very end. It's an idea which is reinforced, I think, in modernity by the psychedelic experience. Commentators on Gnosticism like Hans Jonas have made cases that Heideggerian existentialism, strangely enough, was actually the modern heir to Gnosticism, but that it was a Gnosticism stripped of all mythology, but maintaining the central notion of man being cast into the universe, being cut off from his true home, being involved in a redemptive struggle for which he had no help from the outside. But I think actually that we can sort of go beyond that, or see that as a very simple form of Gnosticism, and see that actually the psychedelic faith that has grown up in postmodern or recent modern society is this faith, the reemergence of this faith in understanding. It is not, and some people have made the case that Gnosticism was a kind of proto-science because it has this faith in understanding. But I think Gnosticism's horror of matter, its viewing of all material projections as demonic and somehow interfering with transformation, makes it a poor candidate for a proto-science. It is more a kind of proto-existential psychology. Now, we are in a situation where I think dualism is a very hard thing for us to avoid. For instance, I have often spoken on my enthusiasm for space travel and transforming man out of the monkey body and into some kind of machine-like hyperspatial biomechanical logos. Well, this kind of extreme anti-naturalism is present in Gnosticism. In fact, Kurt Rudolph in his book Gnosis refers to it as an anti-cosmic dualism. He contrasts it between the Greek belief in a cosmos, a beautiful, ordered, symmetric whole where man has his place and the logos flows from the demiurgus into man, and a vision of balance and harmony, into the Gnostic vision, which is of man being trapped. Now, it's very hard to know which way to go with that. Space travel is a Gnostic undertaking. In fact, the entire phenomenon of modern technological transformation is a highly Gnostic phenomenon. We have accepted the premise, essentially, that there is no ethical imperative from nature. And in fact, Jean-Paul Sartre articulates this absolutely. He says, nature is mute. And that's a Gnostic position if there ever was one, because what it's saying is, you know, you can drain the lakes, you can chop down the forests, you can do all these things. Nature is a demonic production. Its highest destiny is to be used by human beings to free themselves from it. Our situation is such that I'm not sure we have the luxury of a monad at the ontological level. We are the heirs of this Gnostic confabulation of our destiny, to the point where now we must act out their dream of return to the alien God, because they have left us no room to do anything else. perhaps sometime in the past, pick a date, 1500, 1200, everyone has their own favorite date, we could have turned away from this destiny of super overpopulation, reliance on techne to keep our society together. But at any rate, wherever that point was in the past, we are beyond it now. And so we must act out the Gnostic imperative, and it's very important to look at what it meant and what it was saying. The Gnostics had such a horror of the universe that, for instance, they prohibited all forms of sexual union which might lead to conception, because they felt that to conceive was to trap yet more light into matter, and they were interested in the releasing of this light, the gathering of it together and the releasing of it, so that we get two kinds of ethical positions, both purely Gnostic and yet both completely opposed to each other, yet springing from the same perception. One ethical system says, because you are of the nature of the Father, because the world is the creation of a monstrous demon that has nothing to do with you, there is no moral order. You may do whatever you wish. There are no moral constraints. The other position, springing from the same perception, is that because the universe is the creation of a demon, we should have as little to do with it as possible. We should eat as little. We should be hermits. We should practice all kinds of asceticism. Both of these responses to the Gnostic temperament are present in what is called the New Age in our own era. It is the most curious mix of the celibate and the profligate the world has seen since the collapse of Hellenistic syncretism. I hope no one is offended by that. So as I got deeper into this, I am very charmed by the Gnostics. I love the alien god. I love the power that women were given in Gnosticism. They were co-equal always, and in a number of cases, women led powerful Gnostic schools. Melusina at Rome in the 2nd century received the direct transmission from Valentinius and led his school for the 40 years following his death. I might describe for you, simply as an example, the Valentinian cosmology. One of the things about Gnosticism is that it's tremendously rich, and it ranges in its literature from material which is almost like Platonic dialogues to material which is essentially indistinguishable from the chants of Maria Sabina. It ranges through material which is essentially almost entirely crypto-Christian and Judaic, through material which can be directly traced to India and earlier Vedic traditions. I mean, there were definitely connections with the East, with the Bactrian kingdoms in what is now Pakistan. In any case, the Valentinian version of creation goes something like this. The highest and hidden All-Father existed within himself, complete beyond the pleroma, and out of his effulgence of radiance he generated 36 archons, which were like hypostatizations or emanations of his divine nature, similar to the notion of tattvas in Indian philosophy. The 36th and lowest of these archonic emanations was called Sophia and was feminine. She looked back through the pleroma at the mystery of the All-Father and desired to create a universe as he had done, but she was female, not hermaphroditic, And so she brought forth an abortion, a monstrosity. And this thing, and when she saw what she had done, she instantly passed through a number of negative emotions: rage, self-loathing, fury, fear of discovery, hatred, terror. And these emotions of the Sophia at her error condensed into the physical universe which we inhabit. And the monstrosity, the abortion of the Sophia, was made Lord over this universe, and is in fact, at that point, they splice in Genesis and say, and in fact, Jehovah is Ildabaoth. The God of the Jews is the abortion of the Sophia, and by that they get a leg up on Judaism and make it serve their entire cosmology. So having made that leap, you see, they go on to interpret Genesis. And I think if you'll follow me through this, you will see why the Gnostics posed such a danger, because you will feel in yourself the stirring of a kind of doubt, because the Gnostic, the Valentinian interpretation of Genesis rests on the snake. And they say, given what we have said about the abortion of the Sophia, then the snake is to be seen as the messenger of the highest and hidden All-Father. And the snake comes to Eve and says, you should eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And she says, but we were told not to do that. And the snake says, and it's true in Genesis as well, he says, if you will eat of the fruit, you will become like him, Elohim, the thing that put you in the garden. And this is what you must not do. So the Gnostic interpretation is not that there was a fall, but that Eve's eating of the fruit was the first step in the salvational untangling of the delusion of humanity. It was the first step toward gnosis. And, without stressing it, we see here the vegetable symbolism of the use of a plant to attain knowledge, which then somehow frees you. And the notion of an interpretation like that being put forth seriously, to the point where there were Nacenes, another brand of Gnostics, who worshipped Nas, the serpent, worshipped them as the visible manifestation of God in the world, because the serpent brought the message to Eve to advance on the path toward gnosis. So this kind of thing could not be tolerated by the early church. It posed too great a threat, and Gnosticism was threatening in other ways as well. Marcion, whose name one person in 10,000 is probably familiar with, was a Gnostic missionary who caused the formulation of the New Testament, because Marcion had his own canon of holy books, which were the ones he said should be studied to the exclusion of all others. And it was in response to Marcion's Gnostic canon that the patristic fathers began to gather together material and weed it out and say what they wanted and what they didn't want. Now, in spite of this, in the process of destroying Gnosticism, Christianity became what it beheld. This is a phenomenon we meet again and again in history. For instance, I believe we see it in modern times in the fact that every nation which helped destroy the Third Reich is the primary bearer of its philosophy in the post-Nazi period. This same kind of thing, and it happened to Rome when they destroyed Greece. So Christianity, like it or not, is doctrinally a dualism. And this will be denied left and right and up and down, but you get what is called the doctrine of sunum bonum, the doctrine that God is all good. A negative statement of this doctrine that is its logical contrapositive is, therefore evil is an eternal principle. And if that is not Gnosticism, I don't know what is. And there is no provision for this. Evil is eternal. There is no subsuming of Lucifer into the Trinity. There is no, we have an apocalypse, we have a general judgment, but then Lucifer goes off with the fallen souls, presumably unto eternity. And this has been carried forward and is Jung, in his analysis of Christianity, felt that this was its undoing, that there had to be, that a trinity was essentially unbalanced, and he spoke of what he called the fourth member of the Trinity, which is Lucifer, the repressed fourth quadrant that gives the entire thing psychic balance. Because if you deny the presence of evil in the nature of God, then you have this dualism. The clearest statement of this kind of dualism emerges toward the end of the Gnostic outbreak, and I think around 220, Mani is born in the city of Seleucia Ctesiphon in Persia. Mani's father was a Mandaean, about whom I'll say more. But Mani is a very, very interesting person, and according to Karl Ruck, who wrote The Road to Eleusis and is an unimpeachable classicist, Mani was associated with mushroom taking, but he's my only source for that, so I don't know if it's true. Mani always carried a book. He was another one of these people who had a canon. And his career, contrasted to Christ's, is fascinating because there's no doubt that Mani was a real person. We practically have his unpaid electric bills. And yet, he comes only 150 years after Christ, who is this amazingly murky figure. But Mani was a real person. He preached a radical dualism, the eternal war of light and dark, of the principles of light and darkness. And he traveled to India. He converted the kings of Turfan to Manichaeanism, and then he returned to Seleucia Ctesiphon, and his taxes were audited, and he had a big hassle with all that, and they finally threw him in jail, and he died. But he had founded a world religion that confounded Christianity for almost 5 centuries. And there were outbreaks of crypto and neo-Manichaeanism, depending on your favorite heresy, but as late as the 12th century. For instance, the Catharites in southern France were thoroughgoing dualists, and many of their doctrines can be traced right back to Mani. Manichaeanism was carried to the Chinese courts. We know that there were great debates among Buddhists, Taoists, Nestorians, Manichaeans, and Christians in 895 at Khotan in Central Asia, and we know that the Manichaeans walked off with everything. Their exegesis was definitely the most powerful. So what does it mean to care so much about these philosophies long buried under the sand and forgotten? What does it mean? Is there any point in being a noetic archaeologist, which is sort of what I think of this kind of intellectual endeavor? This is where we go off and we dig up broken, defunct, abandoned, forgotten idea systems and shake the dirt out of them and hold them up to the light and see, what can this tell us? And you've heard me do this with the I Ching. Gnosticism is a little different. It's an ideological system, but I think that it was the first formulation of what we call the modern dilemma. The Gnostics said, what we must know is whither we come, whence we go, who we are, and into what have we been thrown. And this, Kierkegaard says exactly the same thing. Finally, we have reached ontological bedrock with the formulation of this question. Now, granted, their solutions were fantastic, and we would call them mythological. But nevertheless, they were grappling with this in a way that we have to respect, and in a way that I think will make more sense to us as we move into our future. I think that Hans Jonas was very perceptive to connect Heideggerian existentialism to Gnosticism. But I think other currents of modern thought are almost as intensely interwoven. I've talked a lot about the deconditioning power of psychedelics, and that the psychedelic users constitute a politically potent class because of this deconditioning, this irreverence for institutions, this willingness to dismiss all structure as baloney because one has seen through it to something else. This is very typical of Gnosticism, and I think that it had a major political component, and that probably the Church's decision to destroy it could not have been so effectively carried out had the Roman authorities not interpreted it also as a political threat, because it was basically a rabble-rousing, proletarian, socialist kind of religion. And its insistence on the utter profanity of the world made it an enemy of the Roman state, which was also a state religion at that time. So it was a powerful force for dissidents and for people who were not fitting into the system. In that sense, I think the feelings that it generated adumbrate very well with the feelings that anyone has gone through who has lived in a town like this for 10 or 15 years and felt themselves a part of the various things that go on. Now, I think the lesson of Gnosticism is to be learned by looking at how the ancient world responded to it. I've already talked about how the Church set about to directly combat it, and in the process became subsumed to its central dogma of dualism. Another response was that of Neoplatonism, probably reaching its most eloquent focus in Plotinus, where he wrote an essay called Against the Gnostics, in which that's the only time the word Gnostics is used. But he is clearly talking about them, and he takes on the doctrine one by one and leads you out of it and shows that it won't serve, that it is logically flawed. Essentially, he analyzes it as a neurosis and says the intensity of this position is no argument for it. Now, that's an interesting position to take because a Gnostic would not respond to that. One of the primary Gnostic tenets had to do with what is called the depth of the call. And this notion of the call is directly resuscitated in Heidegger, where they say the only way you can judge a system is by the depth of the call. However, what undid Heidegger was fascism came along, and the depth of the call was strong indeed, and no reason could be found, therefore, to reject it, and then bad things followed upon that, not only for all of us, but for Heidegger in his career, because he never really regained his philosophical balance after that. So it is, it's very interesting to read Plotinus's thing. against the Gnostics. And he says what has essentially become my conclusion about how all this should be integrated into modernity, which is operationally the perception has to be preserved because of the historical situation we find ourselves in, that only Gnostic solutions will work at this point because there are so many of us. And so we probably are going to have to look at super technical societies and space colonization, abandonment of our association with the planet, all of these things. But the ontology has to be rejected in favor of some kind of unitary principle, some kind of rising above the dichotomy of the cosmic machinery versus the fate of man. And it probably lies in a kind of Taoism. And of course, if you look at Western tradition, I think Neoplatonism comes closer to Taoism than almost any other formulation, although it doesn't come that close. So that is the basic outline of it. Now I'm hoping people have lots of questions, so that, because I think questions will bring out, there are many, many aspects to this thing which your questions can hopefully bring to focus for all of us. Yeah.
The gating question that came to my mind in kind of exploring the views of the Gnostics in regard to nature, seeing it as being used or even worse evil, and then also with the immoral aspects of it. Why shouldn't one well-meaning Gnostic do everyone a favor and blow everything up?
You mean in the present context? Is that what you mean? Well, I think this is our great fear, that a well-meaning Gnostic, what you mean by that is someone for whom ideology is so great a concern that they can't react to the call, to the question, what about life and death? They would reply to that, life in this world is death. And this is, of course, an insane position, or at least a position so radical that we don't want anybody enforcing it on anybody else. Yeah, I think the whole tendency of modern ideology to place itself beyond life is a very dangerous Gnostic tendency. I wasn't going to mention this because I don't want to bum anybody, but a modern adumbration of Gnosticism, where the connection historically is very clear, is the Shia, the Shiite Muslim thing. There were Gnostic writings which were preserved in Syriac, but then Omar, when he, did that thing, all of that material came into the Shia canon. And so, if you know anything about how they approach problems of life and death, I mean, they are what we would call fanatics. Once you opt into this anti-cosmic dualism, you are licensed for anything. I mean, this is beyond Aleister Crowley's do what thou wilt. This is almost you must do what you will. You can't be a good Catholic and logically work yourself to the position that you can do what thou wilt and nevertheless be faithful to your wife and go to your job and put money in the collection plate. You must act on this imperative. And this is what made them such a potent political force. They were probably crazies from the point of view of the Roman authority, thinking nothing of life and willing to do under those who opposed them. And the violence, the vituperative violence of these heresiarchical denunciations of Gnosticism would stand your hair on end. I mean, fire and brimstone was not invented by the Calvinists at Geneva. It was invented by Irenaeus and Hippolytus and Tertullian in their excoriation of the Gnostics. outrageous things, the eating of babies, just mad stuff, all charged against them, because I think they were felt to pose such a potent threat by stating so succinctly the alienation that people felt in the Hellenistic world, because it was a vast empire where slave populations were moved thousands of miles. People became free men often, but then usually in midlife and far from their roots and their language and their upbringing. Many people were strangers to themselves and to each other. And the message of the strange God and the alien nature of the world fell right into it. Yeah.
Here's one thing that I was struck in terms of reading what in the book you would recommend was the intense feelings towards what we might call, what moderns might call good and evil. They're completely divorced, talking about from what we would call ethics, which comes from our classical heritage. I was wondering if you could comment on ethics as a Platonic concept, good and evil gnosis, and then what you talked about in Taoism before.
Well, Platonic ethics always emerge out of the notion of the polis, the integrated community of people. And for Plato, politics is ethics. I mean, that's why in the politics there's so much ethics, and in the ethics there's so much politics. The Gnostics always had, and I don't think I mentioned this previously, there was a dualism even within the church. There were the pneumatics, who were those who knew, who were initiated somehow, and then there were the hyolytics, or the people who were like lay people, who perhaps did not practice the stringent ascetic practices, and who perhaps in fact served as an interface between the initiates and the world, so that they could be in a kind of seclusion. The Taoist thing is almost entirely a set of personal ethics. So what we have here is almost a direct declension from the general ethics of the polis, which is Platonic, to the what do I want to say, not inbred, but xenophobic ethics of the cult, to the personal ethics of the Taoist. Well, in my opinion, this obvious focusing, telescoping of concern inward until we reach the individual has to be the beginning of real ethics. I mean, political ethics are not ethics at all in the modern sense. And cult ethics can lead you into big trouble, as we can see. I'm sure the depth of the call was strong at Jonestown. The depth of the call was strong for Manson. Depth of the call is a lousy way to decide what you're doing. And of course, they came early to that notion. They didn't have the 2,000 years, and speaking now of the Gnostics, they didn't have the 2,000 years of experience that we have. But essentially, from between us and them, there's nothing but a series of appalling incidents where somebody had the depth of the call and was putting somebody else to the torch. One of the most horrifying stories about religion in my bag of tricks, I'll tell, because it relates actually to this. In the early 12th century, in Languedoc and the neighboring provinces in southern France, there arose what are called the Albigensians, gentle vegetarian people who practiced ritual nudity and were perhaps into, some kind of thing like that, hippies, basically. And, when the word got back, there was great stir in Rome, and a person who had been earlier associated with some heretic burning, Simon de Montfort, was sent to take care of the problem. And as they approached, there was a crusade. It's called the Albigensian Crusade, and if you ever want to study the fallacies of religion, that's a good place to begin. They close in on a city. There are 5,000 Albigensians inside, and they're laying siege to this city. And word comes from the city there are also 7,000 Catholics within the city walls. And Simon de Montfort says, kill everyone, God will recognize his own. So here we see one dualism against another, and the depth of the call is such that sanity is banished. And I think this is the thing which has to be conserved. The Gnostics' fear was of a mad God, that the God of this world was insane. They saw this so clearly that for them it was obvious and they couldn't escape it. However, in reaction to this, their heirs, meaning Christianity, was able to betray itself into being the right hand of the insane God. Almost, the literal expression in the world of the demiurge. So I think we have to explore this alienation. It is our legacy from them, and nothing can be done about it. But our ethics must be cosmic. They must be Platonic. They must not give way to the notion of levels and domains of good and of evil, these absolute domains. And so and this is going to be very difficult for us. I have spoken in other lectures about how we are transforming the human image. We are becoming almost a creature of pure information. We are turning in to our machinery. And therefore, we must hold a very humane image of our machinery. We must not seek to become the strange God. God is strange enough as he manifests in us, as it is. And so for us, the whole problem is somehow, in a Gnostic situation, to preserve a unitary view of the world. And though I have mentioned all of these studies of Gnosticism, I think the most important book for the modern dilemma is Philip K. Dick's novel Velas, because he pushes you right up against it there and shows that for anyone who thinks the Gnostic dialogue is red hot and that it is present in the world. So I would urge you to take a look at that book. It is a book I wish that I had written. Are there any more questions? Valis, V-A-L-I-S, by Philip K. Dick. It's in science fiction.
What is the Gnostic perception or identification with either having or being in a human body?
They reject it completely. For the Gnostic, the only thing which is real is the spark, they call it. The technical term for them, they called it the scintilla, the spark of deity that fell into matter. And so, as I said, this led to orgy cults. It also led to very ascetic cults. The only description, we were talking about this as we drove down today, the only description of a Gnostic ritual per se that we have is this thing in Hippolytus, where, you recall I mentioned that they were against any sexual union which would lead to conception. So consequently, they may have been pioneers in the area of blowjobs. The only description we have of a Gnostic ritual is in Hippolytus, where he says that after an unclean union, the woman places the semen in the hand of her partner, and she has some in her own hand, and they, holding hands with the other two free hands, they would then turn and face the deity and offer the semen as a symbol of intervening with the trapping of the light, as if to say, you see, we did not allow the light in this to become trapped in the universe, because apparently they believed that no trapping of light was involved until syzygy of sperm and egg, although of course they didn't have these concepts. but they knew that they wanted to interrupt conception, to the point where the strict adherents of this view disappeared after one generation, obviously. And or there were a lot of conversions, or a lot of backsliding. Yeah.
What is the picture of Christ resurrection?
It's very interesting, and it's extremely varied. We were talking about this earlier today. When you read these, for instance, the Gospel of Thomas is older than Luke or Matthew, and it contains a whole bunch of stories called infancy stories, stories of Christ as a child and young man. They are the weirdest stories. And what does this word weird mean? It means that they have a strange vibration about them. And it is that strange vibration that caused them to be excluded from the canonical books. For instance, as an example, in the Gospel of Thomas, there's a story, since you happen to ask. Oh, I don't have it here. Well, anyway, it's a story about Christ as a young child in which several times he just zaps people dead who get in his way. There's another story in the Gospel according to Philip where Christ, he and the apostles are going or moving from one town to another, and he becomes hungry. And he approaches a bush at the side of the road, and he says, "Make thou food." Nothing happens. He says it again, "Make thou food." Nothing happens. He says it again. And the final line of the incident is, "And he destroyed it with fire." Now, so we see there, you see, an alien Christ, a Christ that we can't relate to. But also you have to remind yourself how dulled our ear is to the Christ that we do know. For instance, I'm sure if you're into this at all, you're familiar with the famous the gospel passage where he institutes the Eucharist. "Take ye and drink, for this is my body and this is my blood, which is being shed unto the conversion of many, for the new and never-ending covenant." This hit like a bombshell, and it even says in the Gospel's description of it, "And many drew away from him at that time." I mean, that was too much. Preaching that you should eat the flesh and drink the blood of the teacher. Just people said, we're checking out on this. It's gotten too weird. Now we've had 2,000 years to smooth it all out and explain what he really meant and how it's okay, and it's this wonderful, beautiful, symbolic statement of theophagia, etc., etc. But how about it when it was raw, and you were there at the table and this rap went around? It would be, I think, quite peculiar. It's interesting that when the Franciscans reached the mushroom cults of central Mexico in the 16th century, and they said, "What do you call this stuff?" And they said, "Oh, we call it Tiananacatl. It means flesh of the gods." They were appalled, and immediately the Inquisition went to work, and everybody who would admit to that was put to death because it was such an appalling notion, and yet it was an exact formulation of the Eucharistic mystery. Yeah. Cat. Yes. I think they had courage. That the thing that the existentialists are always raving about, how you must take personal responsibility and you must, the dreadful freedom rap, I think the Gnostics were into dreadful freedom They recognized that their salvation depended entirely upon themselves and that the world would give them no help at all. It was really, in a sense, a fanatical cult of personal responsibility. And in that context, a proletarian cult lost in the Hellenistic Empire, it didn't have much impact. But if we were to have that intense a sense of self-responsibility, it would be politically a good thing, I think. I think the thing which defeated Gnosticism ultimately was its inability to formulate itself into a single doctrine and a single church and a single declension of consecrated bishops. It was too anarchistic. And in fact, this leads me to a theme that I wanted to mention before we leave all this, and that is, it is anarchy, is a modern adumbration of Gnosticism and nihilism. It was, in the 19th century, I believe it's in the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche says, and now that weirdest of all guests, nihilism, stands at the door. And that's what he meant when he said, God is dead. That is a thoroughgoing Gnostic statement. The Gnostics could have lined up behind that very easily. What they would have meant is that God is dead to us. We are lost in a realm that God cannot reach. We must make our way back to him unaided, because it's very hard for him to send a signal into that. And nihilism, which leads into anarchy, is, I think, very expressive of that perception. Now, anarchy is discredited in the modern situation because people always think that you are making a political pitch. And I think political anarchy is questionable. But, for instance, any of you who have read Paul Feyerabend's Science in a Free Society know that he makes the case there for ideological anarchy. He's, as opposed to the present system where science is the great arbitrator and declares everything either okay or not okay, he says we need an ideological anarchy. There should be no system able to pass judgment on other systems outside of itself. Yeah.
If he's not concerned with us and we are an insect as the seed of that person, everything is
Nothing can be known about him. One of the strange things about Gnosticism is its utter insistence that we belong somewhere about which nothing can be said. That our true, and this is why, this is fairly psychedelic. It's saying, we are utterly not what we appear to be. And we utterly do not belong in this world. We are a part of something, no hint of which can exist in this world. So this unknowability, this faith in the alien God, it is a very odd notion that they could come out in that place.
You might want to mention there the concept of the end of the universe when everyone's finally all the sparks are back to the unknowable God as to what happens to what we call the universe.
Yes, the universe is viewed as a flaw, a kind of temporary imbalance. And when the light is restored beyond the pleroma, the reign of Ildabaoth will end, and everything will be as if nothing had happened. It's as though the entire descent and redemption of mankind is an unnecessary episode in the history of the strange God. It happened, and so it must be restored back to balance. But it needn't have happened. It arose out of the willfulness of the Sophia in the one Valentinian formulation. But it's an effort to heal everything, to make the universe disappear. And it's interesting that it's rather close to the view of modern physics, which says, you know, if the Big Bang had been perfectly balanced, if the forces of parity had been perfectly conserved, the universe would have canceled itself out shortly after it got started. But what we are left with is the tiny portion that did not cancel itself out, the tiny flaw of somethingness in the vast plenum of nothingness. And this somethingness is temporary and eventually will be resubsumed into the plenum. This is very close to modern cosmology. Yes?
About space travel. To go along with the space projects and follow that. What is kind of your thinking?
Well, I don't think there's any choice at this point. I mean, if you just look at the numbers of people who have middle-class aspirations, there isn't enough metal and glass and plastic in the surface of the planet to give all those people their condos and two-car garages. If we are serious about the liberal, democratic, egalitarian values that we have formulated in the last 3 centuries, we're going to have to go off planet to get the energy and the material to fulfill that social program. I think it's inevitable, and that it won't be done for the grand reasons I have just outlined. It will be done because there's just a hell of a lot of money that can be made. But in any case, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think, that man was made to fly, and that, in a way, the Gnostic dream of overcoming, of passing through the cosmic shells and emerging outside the stellar machinery is probably not really a less naive dream than our wish to leave the solar system. It's formulated differently, but I think in both cases it's probably it's something innate in us, and probably not a bad thing. In other words, we can probably only become the stewards of the planet that the no-growth faction would like us to be by leaving the planet. We cannot have it both ways. We cannot maintain a population of 4 to 5 billion on the surface of the planet and really fulfill our duty toward it as our mother, essentially, our matrix of emergence. So I always try to convince people who think space travel is a terrible technical nightmare that actually the birth metaphor is appropriate, and that, yes, the Earth is the cradle of humanity, but we cannot remain in the cradle, or more aptly, in the womb forever. And now we are experiencing a chaos, very similar to the chaos of the Hellenistic world, where the old gods lay shattered. And this chaos which we are experiencing is the chaos at the end of history, and it will end with us transforming ourselves into this sort of angelic creature. But we have to remember that angels come in 2 brands, and that we definitely want to stay on the right side of that. I mean, a demon is only an angel that's been caught. And so yes, I'm I'm a great enthusiast of space travel and of man moving off the planet, which makes me Gnostic, which actually was what caused me to go back into this. Because whenever I speak about space travel, inevitably someone asks how it means to leave nature behind. And I am very enthusiastic about the notion that humanity is essentially an engineering creature, that we take in raw material and we excrete ideas in the form of works of art, engineering, and culture, and that this tendency will find its real dimension of unfoldment in space, where we will not fight the constraints of gravity and wind and day and night and all of these things. We will build cultures which are art. And of course, there is a dualism between art and nature. Of course, the earliest space colonies, it's already being planned. They will attempt to emulate the ecology of Hawaii as exactly as possible. In other words, the notion being 10-degree variation day and night, average temperature 75 degrees, etc., because it's such a challenge to the science of ecology to be able to create and maintain ecosystems of large size in balance. We really don't know how to do that. Obviously, we will learn how to do that probably fairly quickly, 20, 30 years. Beyond that lies the realm where you say we no longer now have to build our space colonies as much like Polynesia as possible. We can build them however we wish. And this will be a great challenge to good taste. Because, yes. Yes.
I'd like to point out that ties into directly with your early comments about dualism again, in the sense that it's the dualism of the Gnostics and the dualism that the God employer Christianity leads to this world where, for example, you can only detect from the view of a libertine or an ascetic. There's a missing point of view there that seems to be very important in terms of our nature as well. You insist that there are two sides and one is black and one is white, and that you have to put everything in groups of two and right. One side or another. You almost inevitably end up in a situation of crisis where not because the bus makes it so you're not accepted.
Yes, it's a hysterical point of view, a two-category view of reality. Everything is either good or everything is bad. It's hopelessly simple, and strangely enough, you overcome its simplicity by going from that to a one-box system where you don't try to divide everything up that way. Definitely. Anything else? Should we take a break and regroup? Let's do that. Before I answer more questions, which I hope there are more, I just wanted to read you a couple of things to give you the flavor of some of this stuff. The first thing I'm going to read is just a small portion of the Gospel of Thomas. Now this comes out of that body of Gnostic literature that is most closely related and competitive with Christianity. This is from the document I mentioned, which is older than Luke and Matthew and is in an uncertain relationship to the Q document from Qumran. The stories of Thomas the Israelite, the philosopher, concerning the works of the childhood of the Lord. I, Thomas the Israelite, tell unto you even all the brethren that are of the Gentiles, to make known unto you the works of the childhood of our Lord Jesus Christ and his mighty deeds, even all that he did when he was born in our land, whereof the beginning is this. This little child Jesus, when he was 5 years old, was playing at the ford of a brook, And he gathered together the water and flowed there into pools and made them straightway clean and commanded them by his word alone. And having made soft clay, he fashioned thereof 12 sparrows. And it was the Sabbath when he did these things. And there were also many other little children playing with him. And a certain Jew, when he saw what Jesus did, playing upon the Sabbath day, departed straightway and told his father Joseph, Lo, thy child is at the brook, and he hath taken clay and fashioned 12 little birds, and hath polluted the Sabbath day. And Joseph came to the place and saw and cried out to him, saying, Wherefore dost thou do these things on the Sabbath, which it is not lawful to do? But Jesus clapped his hands together and cried out to the sparrows and said to them, Go. And the sparrows took flight and went away chirping. And when the Jews saw it, they were amazed and departed and told their chief men that which they had seen Jesus do. But the son of Amas, the scribe, was standing there with Joseph. And he took a branch of a willow and dispersed the waters which Jesus had gathered together. And when Jesus saw what was done, he was wroth and said unto him, O evil, ungodly, and foolish one, what hurt did the pools and the waters do thee? Behold, now also thou shalt be withered like a tree, and shalt not bear leaves, neither root nor fruit. And straightway that lad withered up wholly. But Jesus departed and went unto Joseph's house. But the parents of him that was withered took him up, bewailing his youth, and brought him to Jesus, and accursed him, for that thou hast such a child which doeth such deeds. And it goes on. Eventually he straightens the guy out, but not before he zaps 2 more people dead. So it's an example of you see, what the patristic fathers did was they gathered together all of this literature, and they had a set of ethics that they wanted to canonize. And so they eliminated everything which did not fit with that. Material such as this. This, by the way, is the apocryphal New Testament, the M.R. James edition, which is indispensable for this kind of thing. Now I want to read you something extremely different. To my mind, as different as it gets. This is a very odd text, a portion of the Nag Hammadi library. No other instance of it is known to exist. And this is the one which, well, I'll just read a bit of it and then I'll say what I mean. The name of it is The Thunder, Perfect Mind. And I would advance this one as one with almost no Christian influence and a heavy debt to the East, perhaps to India itself. I was sent forth from the power, and I have come to those who reflect upon me. For I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the members of my mother. I am the barren one, and many are her sons. I am she whose wedding is great, and I have not taken a husband. I am the midwife, and she who does not bear. I am the solace of my labor pains. I am the bride and the bridegroom. It is my husband who begot me. I am the mother of my father and the sister of my husband, and he is my offspring. I am the slave of him who prepared me. I am the ruler of my offspring. But he is the one who begot me before the time on a birthday, and he is my offspring in due time, and my power is from him. I am the staff of his power in his youth. He is the rod of my old age, and whatever he wills happens to me. I am the silence that is incomprehensible, and the idea whose remembrance is frequent. I am the voice whose sound is manifold, and the word whose appearance is multiple. I am the utterance of my name. Now that kind of Gnosticism, it seems to me, folkloric, non-Christian, and bears a striking resemblance to this kind of thing. I am a woman who was born alone, says. I am a woman who fell out by herself, says. Because your book exists, says, your book of wisdom says, your sacred language says, your communication wafer that is, your communion wafer that is given me says, your communion wafer that I share says, in what number do you rest, beloved Father? Father full of life, Father full of frankness. I am a woman of battles, because I am a woman, General says, because I am a woman, Corporal says, I am a sergeant woman, says, I am a commander woman, says, I am the constellation of the sandal woman, I am the staff constellation, here I bring my dew, my transparent dew, says, because I am a fresh dew woman, says, I am a moist dew woman, says, I am the woman of the dawn, I am the woman of the day, I am the saint woman, I am the spirit woman, I am the woman who works, I am the woman who investigates, I am the whirlpool woman, I am the woman who looks into the inside of things. That is Maria Sabina. And on mushrooms, singing in 1956 in the Sierra Mazateca. So I think at the folkloric level, you can see that this Gnostic tendency is always there, just under the surface, and numerous kinds of cultural conditions can bring it out. Now I want to just mention one more aspect of this, and then we'll go back to the questions, which is there is a very interesting sub-school of Gnosticism which needs to be mentioned and is, in my estimation, the most poignantly beautiful formulation of this whole thing, and perhaps is incorrectly considered to be a form of gnosis at all. But it is Mandaeanism, which is has made many claims in its history, depending on who was oppressing it. When it was oppressed by Jews, it claimed to be a Jewish cult. When it was oppressed by Zoroastrians, it claimed Zoroastrian roots. It is claimed to be Indian in origin. It has claimed all of these things. However, what seems to be true is that it, like many Gnostic cults, existed before Christianity, existed before the career of Christ. In its Jewish adumbration, Mandaeanism claims to be the teaching of John the Baptist. And in fact, it is a river cult. It is a baptismal cult. They have what they call the doctrine of the cosmic Jordan. Every Mandaean religious site is a little river, is diverted through a mud wall and into the cult site and then out again. And there must be running water. It is a cult of baptism and of running water. And it existed continuously from the early Hellenistic phase up until the present, possibly. The problem with that is that though it originated in the area of Jerusalem centuries and centuries ago, it located itself in the swamps at the mouth of the Euphrates River, which, if you know what's going on in the world, you know that the most horrendous war in modern history is being fought right there, right now. The city of Basra, which is being repeatedly bombed and strafed by artillery from both sides in the Iraq-Iranian war, is the center of Mandaeanism, or it was until 3 years ago. The modern history of Mandaeanism is not happy. All bishops, all persons with the power to consecrate priests died in a cholera epidemic in 1840. Consequently, at that time, laymen got together and tried to hold the canon together and tried to maintain the rituals. It was a very difficult job because, like all Gnostic sects, Mandaeanism was divided into an inner initiate sect and an outer hoyolitic group. And to the point in Mandaeanism where all the texts were written in a language which only the initiated were ever taught. So when they all died, it was very, very difficult, and Mandaean studies have labored under this problem ever since. But I wanted to give you a feeling for their cosmology. They had many doctrines which were very interesting and not typically Gnostic. One of them was that there was a world of double, a light double was called, which was your soul would come to meet you, and your soul was thought to not be in your body, but to be existing autonomously in a nearby dimension. And at death, you would meet your soul and merge with it. And so the body was thought to be so unclean that the soul, it was not even thought a fitting place for the soul to repose. And one of the bizarre things about Mandaeanism is that it is an extremely ritual-oriented religion, perhaps the most in the world. In the pre-1840 situation, its rules were so strict that if a Mandaean's eye fell upon a non-believer, they were considered polluted and had to go through elaborate cleansing processes. And this is a very difficult thing to not have happen to you when you represent a tiny cult adrift in a population of millions of Muslims. So I wanted to read you a bit about the Mandaean doctrine of the soul so that you could get a feeling for their style. The thing that is interesting about Mandaeanism and somewhat contradicts generally the Gnostic tenor is that it seems very sensitive to biology and to nature. The Mandaean scrolls that we possess have amazingly elaborate depictions of vegetation of all sorts in them, even though they were drawn in a desert culture with almost no contact with vegetation. This is on the Mandaean doctrine of the soul. So it germinated and grew and became strong beneath the throne of the holy Tower Hill. And it happened that in a little year, that is 45 days, I perfected that mystery pregnant and sown therein. Hence from that which seeketh Tula, Tula goeth forth. That which is named silk extracted food for itself, meaning silkworm is the gloss. In other words, it's making a comparison between the soul and the life processes of a silkworm. And the soul, like it, made for herself a sky and earth and formed a body therein, like the cocoon that is formed of silk from the thread which issued from the mouth of the worm. For the speech of the worm is of silk, whereas the speech of the soul is prayer and praise. And so she, the soul, resembleth the worm with the silk and cocoon, for they call it a celestial egg, because two eggs were formed in the mystery. And the one, that which issued from the mouth of the worm, is of silk. The soul, which was placed in the other, wailed and sobbed until her measure was accomplished. And after 45 days, she emerged, forceth her way out by the mouth, departeth and flieth in the supreme ether. And thou seest a mystery in which she had been pent, they cast into the earth, and so she mounteth up into the sky, and none know whither she goeth. Thus the soul resembled this in the body, which, like the worm, she formed and inhabited. For when she desireth to depart from it, she openeth the door for herself to escape from the body, and goeth forth like a dove. Yea, thus doth the soul like it go forth from the body, opening a door from the body for itself, and those doors burst open, and we open its structure for it, else it could not issue from the door of the body. Now, I think this is an interesting passage because it hints at several things. It is, on the exoteric level, simply presenting the Mandaean doctrine of the soul. On the esoteric level, it seems clearly a reference to a kind of yogic practice. Specifically, it seems related to the Po-Wa practices of Buddhism, which involve opening the anterior fontanelle at the top of the head, this opening of doors to the body to allow the passage of the soul hither and yon is a very esoteric doctrine in the East. It's not clear where it originated, but it seems clear to me that the Mandaeans were associated with this sort of thing. To me, this shows the immense fusion of cultural traditions, where here we have a religion which traces itself to John the Baptist, which has an exegesis of the soul which looks like it comes from Patanjali, and which is essentially passing itself off as an Iranian light religion, derivative of Zoroaster and that lineage. So I wanted to mention Mandaeanism in this context because I think it is the positive side of Gnosticism. I think by surviving 2,000 years, they were able to work through the doctrinal contradictions of Gnosticism and actually come out to a place which is pretty attractive. So we talked on our way down here tonight. One of the problems with this speech wasn't that Gnosticism was in a sense depressing, that we didn't want people to go away troubled by the notion of the alien God and of man's wandering in physis. So I urge you, if that is a problem for you, to take a look at the Mandaean solution, because I think it integrates it very well, and it becomes, interestingly enough, almost a religion of biology, in the sense that it's a religion of the life force. For instance, it's the only religion I know of in the entire world, I think, for whom the supreme hypostatization is referred to as they. It is a they worshipping religion. And why this is not clear, but Hibbo Zaiwa, the one great life, is, though it is referred to in this unitary formulation, always the one great life. Its form of address when a pronoun is used is they. So perhaps this is, the dualism of Gnosticism at work, even in the formulation of a language for talking about the supreme God. Now let's talk some more about it. Yes.
So she was 12. What came in between?
Well, in that Valentinian thing, she was 36th, but there were other versions where she was 12, somewhere she was 365. Some of them were like declensions. For instance, I'm loath to speak of this in the presence of experts, but in Hinduism, there is the notion of tattvas, and I believe there are 36, at least in one formulation. Anyway, they start out very ethereal as general principles, like I think the first three are word, object, and cognition, and they have a special relationship to each other. But they are essentially descending categories of greater and greater boundedness. I think in the Hindu way of handling it, you come halfway down and you've reached the subtle earth, and then you descend the rest of the way down till you reach the gross earth. But there were various ways of interpreting these archons. The signs of the zodiac is one way. They were gods of time, and they control sectors of time. So that, for instance, in one adumbration of Marcion system, there were 365 of them. Obviously, they were day demons of some sort. So these were the things which were interposed between, and it was a matter of, in late Gnosticism, you see the question of magic loomed here very large, because first of all, the general mental set of the Hellenistic world was favorable to magic, but a thoroughgoing Gnostic analysis would lead you to the conclusion that magic is ineffective, that only gnosis can lead you to salvation. But in the late period, this became unclear to the practitioners of Gnosticism, and so they proliferated extremely complex magical systems of words, basically, and rituals, we assume. But really, the only artifacts of Gnosticism that we have are carved gems, which are talismanic gems, usually with these archons depicted upon them. The casting of horoscopes was tremendously important in Gnosticism, because that showed your fate. I mean, they took astrology probably more seriously than anyone who's ever taken it, because they were so caught up with the machinery of cosmic fate. These taking a book from the Egyptian cults they contacted that were worshiping Osiris and Hermes Trismegistus, they had the notion of words of power, and they thought that as you threaded your way up through these cosmic shells, there were gateways, and you would be expected to have the correct spells, the correct words of power, the correct talismans to let you through to the next gate. And these gates were moving in constant relationship to each other, and there were moments of propitious death when more than one gate was lined up with another, so that you could just shoot right through. So they really were very contradictory. It's the richness of it. Had they analyzed their own position more clearly and been more doctrinally consistent, they wouldn't have been nearly so interesting. But their own anarchy, their own devotion to, it was really a cult of individual responsibility, which certainly I try to connect to the psychedelic experience, because I don't think it's valid without a sense of individual responsibility. And then it was a cult of this secret knowledge, which was vouchsafed from within. And I want to say something about the logos in this, because many of you who've heard me before know that I associate the spoken voice of the psilocybin mushroom with the logos phenomenon of Hellenistic syncretism. For a Gnostic, the logos spoke gnosis, but it was not the same logos as the Platonists. For the Platonists, the logos was the world soul, actually the demiurgos itself. For the Gnostic, it was a way of gaining information from the higher and hidden All-Father, using the soul as an intermediary. But in both Platonism and in Gnosticism, this contact with an interior voice through contemplation, which is giving true knowledge, was a mystery that was practiced and was very real. One of the wonderful things about Velas is he talks about, this is Philip K. Dick's book that I urged on you all, is he talks about the logos as a creature of pure information, and believes that it actually came, or suggests that it actually came to Earth at a certain moment in time, around the time of the death of Alexander, and that it was a creature of pure information which could actually form a symbiotic relationship with a human being by being known. In other words, here was something which, when you found it out, it began to live inside of you. And he called this the homeoplasmate. The union of man and gnosis was the homeoplasmate. And of course, suggested that Christ was one of these people.
and suggested that that the Gnostics were not kidding when they said that that the inner initiates of the cult were superhuman in some form. They had this symbiotic informational energy creature living inside of them. And then he suggests that this was the reason for stamping it out, that it represented a form of symbiotically fused humanity that was just unacceptable to anybody who didn't have anything to do with it. So that then at Chernoboscian, at the monastery, whatever it was, at Nag Hammadi, these cultists found themselves surrounded. They were essentially the last people to have the complete message of the Logos, and they wrote it down. Now, since it was a creature of pure information, writing it down didn't destroy it. It only froze it, as if you were to put something into a deep freeze. So they wrote down this information and froze it. Then everyone who was a homeoplasmate died, was killed, something happened. But the stuff was in the ground until 1948. And now, if you desire to become a homeoplasmate, you need simply read this book, and it will begin to grow in you. This is a slightly insidious slant on the notion that if you will plant but one mustard seed. But it takes it literally. It says, our faith is a living faith. Take it within you and let it grow, and it will, as though they were actually speaking of something which had a replicatory power beyond that of a simple doctrine. It is a fanciful description of Gnosticism, but I'm sure that it comes closer to the feeling of what it must have been, because they were really trying to inculcate this thing in themselves which would grow and change their view of the world by giving them an entirely new kind of information. Very similar. It's almost as though taking the mushroom and having its experience is to have it grow within you. That would be a very Gnostic way of describing it, to say the mushroom is growing within me. That's why I feel as I do, why I experience as I do. It's a faith which is a physical thing, which is intermingling and interpenetrating body, mind, and soul. And this is how they conceived it. This is what they hoped for it at its best. Yes, anybody else? Yes, in the back.
I was wondering, I've read a lot of Philip K. Dick novels, and he is, to put it mildly, rather paranoid. How much of his worldview of things in Velas is sort of paranoia or feel, not paranoia is a bad word, this sort of feeling of something overbearing, something ready to come down on you. How much is of that do you think is Philip K. Dick's, and how much is sort of this thing that he was describing?
Well, he wrote books more paranoid than Velas. If the final conclusion of paranoia is negative, I think the whole Gnostic thing is totally paranoid. I mean, the idea that God has abandoned you, that there is not one single clue in the entire universe about what to do about it, is a pretty paranoid view. I think that as far as Dick is concerned, I think books like The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch are a much more disturbing kind of view. I actually thought Velas was an optimistic book, although you might differ after you've read it.
I also noticed he had something in there. There was a point where he claimed that the early Christians, or some flavors of them, possessed some kind of could I assume consume some sort of perhaps mushroom, perhaps something, and then sort of to use a computer hacker term, dump themselves into this little symbol, and that they float around they'd be sort of frozen in this little symbol, and then the minute someone N years later came down and looked at the symbol, they would sort of, they would sort of all of a sudden get two personalities.
Well, yes, that was a vehicle that he used in Velas. I think the book that comes closer to his view on these subjects, which is also worth reading if you have an interest in Gnosticism, is the Transformation of Timothy Archer, which is not science fiction, but which is a novel, thinly disguised novel about James K. Pike, who, if you will remember, was Episcopal Bishop of California in the 60s, and his son died, and he began receiving messages from his dead son and presented a tremendous mess to the Episcopal Church because they had to come to terms with this, and they did by having a heresy trial, and he finally died by dehydration in the desert near Qumran, and he had parked his car by the side of the road, taken a bottle of Coke and a road map, and walked out into the desert, 115 degrees, and was dead. And the book claims that he was close to the people who were unraveling the Nag Hammadi material, and that what was coming out of it was the notion that Christ was the follower, get that, the follower of a person named the Interlocutor, who lived 70 years before Christ, or 35 years before Christ, about whom nothing is known, but that the I am statements, the so-called homiletics of Christ, were actually statements drawn from this earlier source. Well, now this is a slightly hysterical version of what came out of Nag Hammadi and Qumran, but not that hysterical. There is enough material to suggest that Christ was someone's follower, and that what he was saying had been said a generation earlier by someone else of whom we have no trace. And, this is hot, hot stuff, because it just cannot be that way if you're Orthodox. And, but anyway, this was what Dick felt about Pike, whom he knew very well. And the Transmigration or Transformation of Timothy Archer is an excellent book to read to see how modern churchmen have dealt with this. It's scandalous that the Nag Hammadi library is not more widely discussed, because it represents the strongest doctrinal challenge to Christianity in its history. There has never been anything this explosive, because it casts such doubt on the moments of the origins, and such doubt on whether or not we have any contact with the career of a Galilean who was the son of a carpenter, and so on. It just seems to explode the entire foundation of Christian hermeneutics. And there's excitement in the schools of theology. They are totally aware of this, but it doesn't seem to have filtered down to the lay level, and perhaps it never will. It may be like the Grand Inquisitor. This thing coming out of the ground is the most unwelcome thing that could appear on the scene in modern Christianity. It fouls it up hopelessly. You realize when I refer to the Grand Inquisitor, I mean the scene in the Brothers Karamazov, the story of Christ returning to a city in which the Inquisition is happening, and his dialogue with the Grand Inquisitor, who knows full well that it's Christ that he's talking to, and who explains to him that he shouldn't have come. They have things well in hand. It's only going to make a problem. Any more questions? Yes.
Would you be willing to give a sketch of the conclusions you reached earlier about psychedelics and history?
Well, by earlier, you mean before I got here this evening?
In the last couple of years.
Conclusions I reached about psychedelics.
He's never heard you speak before. He was wondering how psychedelics fit into what you say tonight.
Well, I think that that this experience of true knowledge coming unquestioned from the outside, for modern people, at least for me, is only accessible through psychedelics. The experience of the logos, the experience of a speaking voice, a voice in the head which clarifies reality and directs moral activity. See, the New Age model for psychedelics has become shamanism. It's just fallen together that way, and there's probably no undoing it at this point. But only a small portion of shamanism worldwide utilizes psychotropic plants. In my personal opinion, it is the kernel of shamanism. But these other traditions may have as much to say about it. And I believe, that knowledge of history is like knowledge of your own life. You are partially amnesic if you don't know what happened in the 15th century, the 12th century BC. I mean, not that I know all these things, but I feel badly that I don't, and I'm working on it constantly, and it's good for you. It's no mere exercise. You actually do become more grounded as you find out who you are. And you recall earlier I mentioned the Gnostics said, whither have we come? Whence are we going? Who are we? And into what have we been thrown? And it seems to me a clarion call to the study of history, if there ever was one. So I illuminate the psychedelic experience because I guess I have the Platonic faith that time is the moving image of eternity. And what the psychedelics are doing are standing you in eternity, in what Thomas Aquinas called the nunc stans, the standing now outside of time. And outside of time, you see all of history. What is that poem? I saw eternity the other night like a golden ring. Well, what you must see when you see eternity is all history at once. Well, it becomes important then to be able to interpret it, to know what slice of the mandala you are getting. And I don't know if you personally are familiar with psychedelics. If you're not, it must sound like a preposterous thing to say. But if you are, you know that historical movies are not at all uncommon, and that you dial up places and times and styles and motifs, and that it shows them to you. And I think all of these past ideological, as I said before, these noetic artifacts that we dig up and show each other. Here is the Osirian religion. Here are the sayings of Nagarjuna. Here is Marcion and his system. These things are aid us in formulating our own understanding. I think that the great wrong turning of modernity is the abstraction of explanation from experience, so that we have tremendous explanatory engines at our command, Boolean algebra, quantum physics, but they nowhere come tangential to experience, so that they are always like institutional faiths. I mean, who has ever seen a quark? Who has ever seen any of these things? And what we need are maps of the world true to experience. And at first, they may seem very quaint because they will be hundreds of years old or drawn from some bizarre religious or cultural tradition. But that is just the patina on the outside. When you knock off all the rough spots, as Hans Jonas did with Gnosticism, you discover Heideggerianism. You discover, that what first appeared very quirky and quaint and removed from our concerns is actually central. So I really think that that the psychedelic meditation par excellence is the recovery of lost historical time. And I think William Blake lined up behind that when he said, nothing is lost in eternity. And this is the idea that if nothing is lost, there must be a point to recovering it. Shaman, by the way, do not have history. Isn't this a strange thing? They couldn't possibly follow my prescription because it assumes a literate tradition of record keeping. What they have reference to are the great oral myth cycles that have been handed down to them. The two things are not that different, but we really need to recover the power of myth in our own lives. And it's very hard to know even what that means. But what it means is we need to begin to have theories of being that are true to experience. And taking of psychedelic drugs pushes this to a crisis level because the notion of experience becomes so expanded in the presence of psychedelic drugs. That's why I have said, a physics of experience is what's needed, and it's very hard to imagine what that would be. It would be a physics which would explain to you why the world is as it seems in fact to be, rather than a physics which explains to you that the world is, wave packets moving at sublight speeds according to these tensor equations. It's a perfect explanation, except that you can't find people in it anywhere, or the scale from which you are doing the observing. And so it's a task of 500 or 600 years to move away from a trend so overwhelming. But I think psychedelic drugs will be central to it because they decondition you from receiving doctrine from above. In other words, there won't be state faiths handed down. Everyone will be expected to make sense of their reality and to have a theory to lay back on their reality, which makes it more real to them. It's all about personal responsibility. And that's, I think, the major message of the Gnostics, that they were taking responsibility for their situation in the world, in a way in which these other Hellenes were not. They were running after less thought out ontological positions. Just, your everyday run-of-the-mill sort of religions. But the Gnostics were going much further. They were trying to come to grips with experience and being. They were very modern. This is why these moderns like Jonas and Rudolf and Heidegger and all these people have gone back to them so fruitfully, because they really formulated these things. Yeah.
What led the Gnostics to accept a dualistic conclusion?
It seemed to them absolutely self-evident. And I think that must mean that it was really a chaos in the Hellenistic world. So many people uprooted, so many languages, so many religions. To them, it was as obvious as it is to us that the world is a mess. I mean, if you were to ask the reasons for modern alienation, it's because we see that life is cheap, that politicians can't be trusted, that priests are scoundrels, that everything has played us false. And I think they felt that way. There was a real sense of loss and wandering. I mean, the great pinnacles, Rome was infected with a sense of its own vulgarity. That's why the empire spoke Greek. That's why everybody was educated in Greece. The empire was vulgar, and people who were intellectuals knew this, and they knew that it was based on human subjugation of other people, and that it was basically not a hopeful situation. It seemed obvious to them. And that's why I think it was a proletarian, largely radical, dissident kind of thing. It didn't make great inroads into the aristocracies. Yeah.
Isn't there a way in which history is part of the state faith? I mean, that knowledge comes down from above?
You mean that history is distorted for the purposes of the state? Yes, that's right. You're exactly right. But what confounds that kind of thing is every once in a while something like these urns full of texts come along where it's like, you remember the old ads for the Rosicrucians where the cowled priests are saying, this knowledge must die? Well, that knowledge, probably from the point of view of many, many people, should have died. The Nag Hammadi library, having once gone into the ground, should never have come out again, because now it challenges our faith. Yes, history is normally part of the state's machinery of repression.
Kind of like a little bit of knowledge of the dangerous thing.
That's right. Well, you know, I don't know, many people have said it, perhaps Hitler most recently, that history is the story told by the survivors. But you see, it isn't true in this case, because the survivors were all Christians. They thought they'd handled this matter at Nag Hammadi. But 1922 years later, it returns, and it outlived the survivors. The knowledge could not be destroyed, and now it's being spread throughout the world, and its great enemy, Christianity, is now 2,000 years older, too senile, too uncertain of itself to grab James Robinson and burn him at the stake and come and find all of us and stamp this out. So, yes.
Along the same lines, it is possible, and this is the psychedelic view again, to take the same approach to what is given to you as history from the state and reinterpret it. An excellent example of that would be early Minoan Crete. The discovery was made at a time when a certain view of how Mediterranean cultures worked was extant in the archaeological community. And a lot of conclusions were drawn on that basis, that if you go back to the original evidence, which was very good archaeological work, you can come to completely different and radical conclusions. And some people are beginning to do so.
I might suggest, by the way, that that was done after reading about the culture of the state religion and getting as many of the artifacts as we could by pictures in full-color pictures, and then using psychedelic drugs over 2 or 3 separate occasions and trying to see what those images meant. And the meaning was a lot different than what the immediate meaning was a lot different than what was written by supposed scholars of the late 19th century and early 20th century tradition.
That's right.
But it takes a lot of research and work before you're going to utilize the drugs in that fashion.
That's right. Well, Gnostic studies are now in their infancy, because a great deal of work has to be done to assimilate all of this. This is why, in a sense, the occasion for this lecture was the publication of this book, Gnosis, by Kurt Rudolph, who is one of the foremost scholars of Gnosticism, but the first to integrate the Nag Hammadi material into a book like this. Hans Jonas's book on Gnosticism, which is a wonderful book, is now slightly outdated, because at the time he wrote it, these things that from Nag Hammadi were only partially translated and understood. But yes, it's the uses of history are many. Any more questions? One more question?
Oh, I was going to throw out that
Yeah.
sometimes interesting things like that sort of challenge the standard way of thinking sort of pop up just out of nowhere, like John Dee and his, I got a hold of the British Library manuscripts on microfilm and began running them through my enlarger and printing them, and that seems to sort of, his sort of ideas about the world seem to sort of challenge lots of sort of, standard Christian theory, and also even standard occult theory. In fact, I it seemed a really adept thing that the Golden Dawn actually managed to sort of somehow integrate it into their practices, because it seemed in some ways totally different.
Well, Dee, he doesn't spring ex nihilo. He is part of a long tradition that was thin at times, but largely underground. I mean, there are only two strains, or I will say there are only two strains in European magic, the schools of Dee and the schools of Bruno. And everything after them can be traced back to them. Both Dee and Bruno can be traced back to Henry Cornelius Agrippa, who was the student of Trithemius, Bishop of Sponheim. So we get it at least back that far. But yeah, Dee is an interesting case, and in a certain sense, Gnostic in temperament. I didn't talk tonight at all about the relationship of Gnosticism to what is normally called Hermeticism. Hermeticism is the alchemical tradition. It sort of straddles the middle between Orthodox Christianity and Gnosticism. It had the notion that there might be a redemption of the light from matter through manipulation of matter, and through that laid the grounds for modern chemistry. And the Trismegistic hymns, the writings of the Corpus Hermeticum, offer, I think, a bridge out of the extreme nihilism of Gnosticism, and it's still not Christian by any manner or means. I wanted to mention just one last thing, which is simply a notion or an idea. I mentioned Mandaeanism and its clarity and its psychedelic sensitivity to biology. I think that it reached its clearest expression in a cult about which very little is known, but which I think would be an interesting object for study. It's called the Cult of the Peacock Angel. And the peacock angel is a hypostatization of some sort of this biological they, Hibble Zaiwa, but it sounds like a psychedelic cult. And I don't know if the people are here tonight who are the Soma people who look at Pergamon Harmala, but I would think that based on doctrine, if you were looking for an Iranian cult that had a psychedelic sacrament based on Harmine or Pergamon Harmala, that the cult of the Peacock Angel would be an excellent one to look at. And it still exists, or perhaps these areas are so screwed up politically now. I mean, it existed in the hills of Lebanon until recently, perhaps. I want to thank you very much for coming out on Holy Saturday night. Perhaps I'll tell you one more story to remind you of the strangeness of the Gospels themselves, which we accept so much, so easily. You know, it's a cliche, of course, that the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John is the most Gnostic text in the New Testament. And in fact, the entire Gnostic faith is basically set out there in principio et verbum et verbo caro factum est. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him was made nothing that has been made. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness grasped it not. And that is the formulation of the Gnostic cosmology, that the light shone in the darkness, but the darkness grasped it not. And the Latin word is, I think, comprendenat. Anyway, it is the Latin word in which to grasp is also to understand. It's essentially that the darkness could not comprehend the light. That is the best known instance of Gnosticism in the Gospels. The instance I want to point out to you that you can take away and meditate on its meaning as a koan, if you wish, is that on Easter morning, when the women came to the tomb and found the stone rolled away, I believe it was Anne, I'm not sure which one, approached the Lord as if to touch him. I think this is in Mark. It's only in one gospel. Luke, is it? Somebody knows. Anyway, and Christ said to her, "Touch me not, woman, for I am not yet of the nature of the Father." And I just leave you with this. What does it mean? Why have we never heard it explained? Go and look yourself. What did the risen Christ mean when he said, "Touch me not, for I am not yet of the nature of the Father"? It would have been weird enough had he said, "I am not yet of the nature of the Father," but "touch me not" seems even more suggestive. Thank you very much for your attention to a difficult subject.